April 21st, 1944. Princess Elizabeth turns 18. Her mother, the Queen Consort, gives her a tiara, a Cartier piece purchased by Elizabeth's father on November 18, 1936, for £1,400. 16 graduated diamond scrolls, 739 brilliant cut stones, and 149 baguette diamonds set into a platinum band. The princess lifts it, holds it, places it somewhere safe. She never wears it. Not once, not in public, not in any photograph taken across her entire 70-year reign. For the next 67 years, the piece sits in the vaults. Then, on the morning of April 29, 2011, it appears on Catherine Middleton's head as she walks toward Westminster Abbey, and hundreds of millions of people watch a tiara that no one has seen the original owner wear, finally meeting its occasion. That gap, 67 years of ownership, 0 public appearances, isn't an accident. It isn't an oversight. It's the grammar of royal power expressed in diamonds. There is a second monarchy the cameras don't show you. Not the balcony monarchy, not the Abbey monarchy. The vault monarchy. Behind the official portraits and the state banquets, behind the carefully chosen gowns and the measured public smiles, Elizabeth II controlled a private collection of approximately 300 pieces of jewelry, including around 50 tiaras. These were legally and institutionally distinct from the crown jewels, the 100-plus ceremonial objects containing 23,000 gemstones held in trust at the Tower of London, which no monarch can sell, gift, or personally direct. Those belong to the nation. The personal collection was hers to wear, hers to loan, hers to silence. Royal jewelry isn't decoration. It's a map of favor, restraint, memory, scandal, and succession. The pieces Elizabeth II chose to wear tell one story. The pieces she chose not to wear tell another, and it's the more illuminating one. Royal jewelry in the British system operates across 3 distinct categories, and the differences aren't academic. The crown jewels, St. Edward's crown, the imperial state crown, the orb and scepter, more than 100 objects in total, are held in trust by the sovereign for the nation. They pass automatically to the next monarch upon accession, unchanged and legally unreachable as private property. Oliver Cromwell had them broken up in the 17th century. Since then, only additions have been made. No subtraction, no diversion, no personal bequest. The royal collection, overseen by the Royal Collection Trust that Elizabeth II formally established during her reign, is a broader institutional category. Artworks, historic objects, and some jewels held on behalf of the monarch and the nation jointly. This is the collection of Rembrandts and Rubenses, of Fabergé objects and historic furniture, of royal records stretching back to the reign of Henry VIII. The third category, the personal collection, is different in kind. Items owned as private property, inherited through the family line, received as gifts, or occasionally purchased. At Elizabeth II's death on September 8, 2022, her personal collection passed as private property to King Charles III. It wasn't subject to public inventory requirements. Its full contents remain unknown. The personal will of the Queen is sealed and won't be made public. This opacity is structural, not accidental. Personal royal jewelry has always operated in a space between visibility and concealment, displayed selectively, managed according to no publicly codified law, moved through generations as a private parallel system running alongside the constitutional one. After Elizabeth's death, royal expert Katie Nicholl described the hierarchy plainly. the Queen Consort gets first choice of the late Queen's personal jewelry, followed by the Princess of Wales. She was describing custom, not statute. No Lord Chamberlain formally approved tiara loans. No palace committee reviewed which pieces went to which women. The Queen's personal discretion was the sole governance mechanism from first to last. When Elizabeth II loaned the Grarevel emerald kokoshnik to Princess Eugenie for her 2018 wedding, that was a personal act of sovereignty. When she chose, for the entirety of her reign, not to loan the Strathmore Rose tiara to any woman, including herself, that was equally sovereign. Nobody overruled her in either direction. Nobody asked why. The vault opened when she chose to open it. The personal collection Elizabeth eventually controlled had grown through several distinct waves of inheritance. Her grandmother, Queen Mary, who died in March 1953, just 10 weeks before the coronation, assembled what historian Hugh Roberts describes in The Queen's Diamonds as a collection defined by vivid appreciation of jewelry and her recognition of its important ceremonial role in the life of the monarchy. Mary left Elizabeth virtually everything: the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, the Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara, the kokoshnik, the lover's knot, the classic diamond bandeau. A second wave arrived in March 2002, when Elizabeth's mother died at 101. The Queen Mother's collection, itself swelled by the Grarevel bequest of 1942, passed entirely to Elizabeth, who by then had been queen for 50 years and had long since established exactly what she needed from a tiara. Most of what arrived in 2002 stayed in the vault for the rest of Elizabeth's reign. Before the silence, the sound. Elizabeth II had a settled, deliberate wardrobe of tiaras she wore consistently across her 70-year reign. Understanding why she chose these particular pieces and how thoroughly she chose them is the necessary foundation for understanding why she never chose others. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara is the single most documented case. It was created by Gerard in 1893, bought by a fundraising committee named after women's clubs across the British Empire as a wedding gift for Princess May of Teck, later Queen Mary. In 1914, Queen Mary had the original pearl top removed so the pearls could be incorporated into her new lover's knot tiara and replace them with diamonds from the Surrey fringe tiara. She loaned it to Princess Elizabeth for her 1947 wedding. Elizabeth wore it publicly for the first time the following year on her first official trip to Paris. That first outing in 1948 launched what became the most worn tiara of her entire reign, an association so complete that when Queen Camilla wore it at a coronation banquet at Mansion House in 2023, the gesture read as a direct act of inheritance, one reign explicitly nodding to the one before. Over the next 7 decades, the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara appeared at state banquets on every continent, at diplomatic receptions at Buckingham Palace, at royal galas from Edinburgh to Ottawa to Fiji. It was photographed for official portraits that ended up on stamps and currency. The Royal Watcher blog, which maintains the most comprehensive chronological record of its appearances, documents it at the Czech state visit in 1996, at the landmark first visit to Ireland in 2011, at state visits for the King of Norway, the President of China, the King of Spain. In December 2019, it appeared at the Diplomatic Corps reception at Buckingham Palace, confirmed as her final public tiara appearance. Why this piece for 71 years? The design is architecturally balanced, a diamond diadem with a Windsor motif pattern that reads cleanly at any camera distance, neither overwhelming nor disappearing into background blur. It suited Elizabeth's height, her hairstyle, and her established visual identity. It had no complicated provenance, no difficult associations, no ghost of a difficult personality behind it. It became hers completely. The Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara operated at a higher register of drama. Originally made for Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, wife of Grand Duke Vladimir, it survived the 1917 revolution in circumstances that read more like a thriller than a jewelry provenance record. According to accounts that have circulated since, the jewels were smuggled out of St. Petersburg in a series of concealed packages, while the revolution dismantled the empire around them. The Grand Duchess herself escaped last. She died in 1920. Her children sold parts of the collection to support themselves. Queen Mary purchased the Vladimir tiara at auction in 1921. Mary then commissioned Gerard to restore the damaged piece and add 15 emerald drops from the Cambridge collection, engineering a mechanism that allowed the original pearl drops to interchange with emeralds depending on occasion. Elizabeth II inherited it in 1953 and wore it in 3 distinct configurations across her reign, with pearl drops, with emerald drops, and eventually, without any drops at all, the diamond circles alone. The documented appearances are specific: a formal portrait at Buckingham Palace in December 1958, wearing it with emeralds in Ottawa in 1967, a White House ball in 1976 where she danced with President Gerald Ford, a 2001 portrait by photographer John Swanell. In 1988, she had the frame repaired again to update its structure. She wore it so consistently, for so long, in so many variations, that it functioned almost as 3 separate pieces within her rotation. Queen Alexandra's Kokoshnik tiara, 61 vertical platinum bars set with over 400 perfectly matched diamonds, the whole thing designed in 1888 to mimic the style of Kokoshnik tiaras worn at the court of Alexandra's sister, Empress Maria Fyodorovna of Russia, made its public debut on Elizabeth II during her Commonwealth tour in 1954 and remained a fixture for the rest of her reign. The broad halo silhouette, drawn from the traditional Russian headdress of the same name, reads with unmistakable authority at the scale of state occasions. It creates a visual frame around the face that registers from 50 feet away. At the White House ball in 1976 with President Gerald Ford, at state dinners in Reykjavik in 1990, in her 2001 portrait by John Swanell, the Kokoshnik's presence is consistent and deliberate. These 3 tiaras, plus the Burmese ruby tiara she commissioned from Gerard in 1973 and the Belgian sapphire tiara she acquired in the early 1950s, formed the core of her repeat wear vocabulary. The Burmese ruby tiara's construction is worth noting. Elizabeth had Gerard build it using diamonds taken from the dismantled Nizam of Hyderabad tiara, a piece she had worn in the early years of her reign before its structural instability became unworkable. Combined with rubies that the people of Burma had given her as a wedding present in 1947. She commissioned the new piece in 1973, but wore it publicly only once, at a state visit to Malta in 2005, the last tiara she ever debuted across her 70-year reign. The Nizam of Hyderabad tiara demonstrates the physical constraint most sharply. She wore it at the Royal Variety performance in 1952, her only use of the full piece as monarch, and at a state dinner in Ottawa during a tour of Canada, after which she is recorded as telling a companion that the tiara had felt close to falling in the soup. The physical sensation of wearing a tiara that doesn't grip correctly, on a specific head, through hours of formal dining and sustained conversation, is an immediate and decisive reality that no amount of beauty resolves. The tiara was eventually dismantled. Its diamonds became the foundation of something that did work. By 1952, Elizabeth II's hairstyle had settled into the form that would remain essentially constant for the next 70 years. A symmetrical curl set, created with small rollers by her personal hairdresser Ian Carmichael in a technique that Harper's Bazaar describes as a lasting dedication to a look. Carmichael worked with her for 23 years. During the COVID-19 lockdowns, when he could no longer visit the palace, her dresser Angela Kelly stepped in to maintain the set. Even isolated, the hairstyle remained unchanged. Kelly detailing the process in her memoir, The Other Side of the Coin, describing the specific placement of the rollers the Queen herself guided her through. That silhouette, a specific height, a specific symmetrical profile, was the base on which every tiara decision rested for 7 decades. Pieces that worked within it became permanent fixtures. Pieces that didn't, regardless of their beauty or provenance, had nowhere to fit. By the time Elizabeth II inherited her mother's entire jewelry collection in March 2002, she had spent 50 years establishing exactly what she needed from a tiara. What arrived in that inheritance didn't disrupt her wardrobe. It entered the vault, and it stayed there. In September 2023, the court jeweler published an article with a straightforward title, 10 Tiaras that Queen Elizabeth II owned but never wore in public. 10 documented cases. The list makes no claim to be complete. The vault's full contents aren't publicly cataloged, and the sealed will offers no inventory. But 10 confirmed cases across one woman's 70-year reign is a substantial record, and it begins with the piece that carries the most intimate family history in the entire collection. The Strathmore Rose tiara was made in the late 1800s, purchased from the London dealer Catchpole and Williams by Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore. On April 26, 1923, he gave it to his youngest daughter, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, as a wedding present when she married Albert, Duke of York, at Westminster Abbey. The design features wild rose motifs inspired by the Tudor rose, set in diamonds, silver, and gold, with an alternative configuration allowing 5 sapphires to replace the diamond centers of each rose. The tiara's name carries the family identity directly. Strathmore is the Bowes-Lyon earldom, and the roses it depicts are the heraldic symbol of the house the bride was leaving. For her portraits in the early 1920s, the new Duchess of York wore it across the forehead, as was the Edwardian custom. The full profile of the roses facing forward, the sapphire version creating a different visual weight than the diamond-only configuration. The photographs circulated widely at the time of George VI's succession in 1936. The young Duchess's image reproduced across Britain in the context of an unexpected coronation. In 1935, she wore the sapphire version specifically, paired with a sapphire brooch, at the Royal Variety performance. That performance, documented by the Royal Watcher, marks the final public royal wearing of the piece for approximately 88 years. When the Queen Mother died in March 2002 at 101, the Strathmore Rose passed to Elizabeth II. Multiple sources confirm the same conclusion. Elizabeth never wore it publicly during her lifetime, and there is no record of her lending it to any other member of the family either. Speculation about the tiara's physical condition has circulated online for years, suggesting the piece may be in disrepair. Hugh Roberts's book, The Queen's Diamonds, published in 2012, contains high-definition photographs of the tiara that the court jeweler notes help dispel that rumor. The piece is intact. The roses can be removed and worn as brooches, as Roberts documents. A detail confirming the structural flexibility of the design remains fully functional. The choice not to wear it wasn't mechanical. It was something else. One explanation follows naturally from the specific character of the object. The Strathmore Rose isn't a royal acquisition. It's a family gift, the gesture of a Scottish earl giving his daughter something personal on the day she married into a world that would soon consume her personal life entirely. The Queen Mother wore it during the years when she was still, in some sense, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who had made an unexpectedly grand marriage. She stopped wearing it before that framing dissolved entirely. Elizabeth II received it in 2002 as her mother's estate, But the piece had never been part of the monarch's vocabulary. It had been part of the Duchess of York's vocabulary. Whether Elizabeth kept it as memory rather than tool, whether she simply never found an occasion that asked for it, whether the rose motif didn't fit her established aesthetic, we can't know. No named source documents her reasoning. What is documented is what happened next. In November 2023, Catherine, Princess of Wales, wore the Strathmore Rose tiara at the South Korean state banquet at Buckingham Palace. Approximately 100 years after the Queen Mother first received it from her father on her wedding day. It was the first time a member of the royal family had worn the piece publicly in nearly 9 decades. Royal observers read the choice as a deliberate engagement with the family's pre-Windsor history, a signal that Catherine understood the specific genealogy she was stepping into, not just the public monarchy, but the private one that preceded it. After nearly a century in the vault, the piece had found both its occasion and its woman. The Grarevel Emerald Kokoshnik tiara has a stranger, longer, and more layered silence. On September 15, 1942, Dame Margaret Helen Grarevel died at her London home at the age of 78. She was, by birth, the illegitimate daughter of William McEwen, a wealthy Scottish brewer who had made his fortune in the Edinburgh brewing industry and later served as a Liberal Member of Parliament. Margaret was his only child and his sole heir, and she used his considerable fortune with remarkable precision to build a social empire that lasted nearly 4 decades. In 1906, she purchased Polesden Lacey, a Regency villa in the Surrey Hills, and transformed it into one of the great house party venues of Edwardian and interwar England. The weekend guest lists at Polesden Lacey read like a roll call of European royalty and British political power. Kaiser Wilhelm II before the First World War, King Edward VII, the Prince of Wales, who would briefly become Edward VIII, Lord Curzon, Arthur Balfour. Margaret Grarevel, always Mrs. Ronnie to her circle, was nicknamed a collector of kings by her contemporaries, a phrase that captured both the genuine warmth of her relationships with royal figures and the deliberate social architecture behind them. Her relationship with the British royal family was intimate and long-standing, in a way that went beyond hostess and guests. When Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married the Duke of York in April 1923, the couple spent part of their honeymoon at Polesden Lacey as guests of Margaret Grarevel, a measure of how close the connection already was. When Dame Margaret wrote her will, she left money to Princess Margaret and to Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, and, for Queen Elizabeth, the new Queen Consort, George VI's wife, her friend of decades, she left everything else. With her loving thoughts, all jewels and jewelry. Over 60 pieces, the largest single private jewelry bequest to a British royal in the 20th century. In 1943, a black tin trunk arrived at Buckingham Palace, plain, institutional, carrying no indication of its contents. Inside were at least 2 tiaras and several dozen other pieces, emerald necklaces, diamond bracelets, chandelier earrings, pearl pieces, brooch sets. The collection represented decades of Margaret Grarevel's acquisition, pieces she had commissioned from Boucheron and Cartier over the course of a long life spent at the intersection of enormous inherited wealth and cultivated royal access. The Grarevel Emerald Kokoshnik tiara was among them, made by the Parisian house of Boucheron in 1919. Its platinum, Kokoshnik-style setting rises into a broad ceremonial headband in the Russian imperial fashion. Exactly the shape popularized at the court of the Romanovs. Exactly the style that Queen Alexandra had commissioned in diamond form back in 1888 as a silver wedding present. The Kokoshnik center stone weighs 93.70 carats. Current valuations place the complete piece at approximately $13 million. It's one of the most valuable tiaras in the British royal collection, and for 75 years after it arrived at Buckingham Palace, no member of the royal family wore it publicly. The Queen Mother wore other pieces from the Grarevel bequest regularly. The Grarevel tiara, a diamond honeycomb design created by Boucheron's chief designer, Lucien Hertz, in 1921, later altered by Cartier, appeared at royal engagements by 1947 and eventually became the Queen Mother's most frequently worn tiara, her signature piece for decades of state occasions and formal receptions. The teardrop earrings, purchased from Cartier in 1938, appeared at her 100th birthday in June 2000, alongside a 5-row pearl necklace, the small stones catching the light for photographers as she stood at the Clarence House gates. But the Kokoshnik specifically? The court jeweler states it precisely. The tiara was deposited in her royal jewelry collection in 1943 and stayed there until her death in 2002. 59 years. The Queen Mother owned the most valuable emerald tiara in the British royal collection for 59 years and never placed it on her head in public. When she died in March 2002, Elizabeth II inherited it. For 16 more years, it remained in the vault. The structure of that silence, spanning 2 consecutive female owners, a combined total of 75 years, across the reigns of 3 monarchs, resists simple explanation. Several media outlets have reported, without attribution to any named palace official, that Meghan Markle's first choice of tiara for her May 2018 wedding was the Grarevel Emerald Kokoshnik, and that this wasn't approved. Those reports circulated widely. The specific sourcing has never been verified. No named palace correspondent, no named member of the household, has confirmed either the request or any refusal. What is confirmed is that Meghan wore Queen Mary's diamond bandeau, the 1932 Gerard piece, with its County of Lincoln brooch centerpiece, which Elizabeth had inherited from Queen Mary in 1953 and had never worn publicly herself. Whether the Kokoshnik was considered and passed over for that occasion or for any other reason remains unverified speculation. 6 months after Meghan's wedding, in October 2018, Princess Eugenie wore the Grarevel Emerald Kokoshnik at her wedding to Jack Brooksbank at Windsor Castle, on explicit loan from Queen Elizabeth II. It was the first time any member of the royal family had worn the piece publicly, ever. A tiara that had arrived at Buckingham Palace in an anonymous black tin trunk in 1943 made its way through the estates of 2 queens over 5 decades, and then walked out of the vaults for the first time at a wedding in the same castle where it had been kept. The math is direct. From delivery to first public royal wearing, the gap was 75 years. Eugenie had worn a custom gown specifically designed to display her scoliosis surgery scar, a deliberate act of visibility that set the register of the entire occasion. The Kokoshnik, with its $13 million emerald center stone and its broad Russian headband silhouette, matched that register precisely. Whatever reasons had kept the piece in the vault through Margaret Grarevel's era, the Queen Mother's ownership, and Elizabeth II's entire reign, the piece finally had an occasion that asked for exactly what it offered. The Cartier halo tiara's provenance and silence form the clearest and most documentable case in the entire collection. Every step of its ownership chain is confirmed. On November 18, 1936, the Duke of York walked into Cartier's London premises. He wasn't yet king. He wouldn't become king for another 3 weeks, when his brother, Edward VIII's abdication on December 10th, would push an entirely unexpected succession into motion. In November, he was still simply Albert, Duke of York, younger son, a man who had never expected the throne, buying a gift for his wife. He paid £1,400 for a tiara, 16 graduated scrolls in platinum, set with 739 brilliant cut diamonds and 149 baguette diamonds, the whole thing calibrated to a sense of delicate opulence rather than formal grandeur. 7 years later, on April 21, 1944, the Duchess of York, now Queen Consort, the surprise queen of a surprise king, gave the piece to her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, as an 18th birthday present. The court jeweler describes it as believed to be the first tiara the future Queen Elizabeth II owned. She was 18, in the middle of a world war, a princess who had registered for wartime service with the Auxiliary Territorial Service 4 months earlier, and who was already understood to be the heir to the throne. No photograph exists of Elizabeth wearing the halo, not from her wartime years as princess, not from the period of her engagement to Prince Philip in 1947, not from the coronation year of 1953, when she was photographed in multiple tiaras for official portraits, not from any of the roughly 280 tiara-appropriate state occasions across her 70-year reign. The court jeweler is unambiguous. We have never seen a photograph of Princess Elizabeth wearing the tiara. Instead, she loaned it systematically to the women around her. Princess Margaret wore it at the 1953 coronation, the first documented public appearance of the piece on any royal head. Elizabeth formally gave the tiara to Princess Anne in 1972, shortly before Anne's engagement to Mark Phillips. In 2011, Zara Phillips, Princess Anne's daughter, wore it at her own wedding to Mike Tyndall. And on the morning of April 29, 2011, Catherine Middleton sat in the rooms at Buckingham Palace before her wedding and had the piece placed on her head, on loan through the royal family from a woman who had received it as a birthday gift 67 years earlier and had never worn it out of the house. Tatler subsequently observed that Catherine wore the Cartier halo tiara at her wedding to Prince William, and that it was a fitting choice, a piece crafted for a woman who became queen. The most straightforward explanation for the non-wearing is one of timing and momentum. Elizabeth received the tiara at 18, before her public tiara rotation had begun. By 1952, when she became queen and started wearing tiaras regularly at formal state occasions, she had already inherited pieces from Queen Mary with deep, documented histories and clear visual authority. The girls of Great Britain and Ireland, the Vladimir, the Kokoshnik. Against that established vocabulary, a piece she had never worn publicly had no anchor. Introducing it would have required a deliberate decision to debut something new, rather than reach for what was known and trusted. Elizabeth made exactly that kind of deliberate debut with the Burmese ruby tiara in 1973, commissioning it specifically for a gap in her collection. She never made it with the halo. The piece spent most of its life in the royal collection as a loan vehicle rather than a worn jewel, passed outward from the woman who owned it to the women who needed it, finally arriving at a public life more public than any Elizabeth herself had given it. Beyond those 3 central pieces, the vault held others with their own specific silences. The Delhi Durbar tiara was made for Queen Mary in 1911, commissioned specifically for the Delhi Durbar ceremony, at which George V and Mary were proclaimed Emperor and Empress of India before 30,000 subjects in a specially constructed amphitheater outside Delhi. The tiara was built for that scale, an enormous piece with height and visual mass calibrated to an imperial ceremony, the gemstones selected to match the Durbar's stated grandeur. Elizabeth II inherited it when Queen Mary died in 1953. She wore the rest of the Delhi Durbar parure at state occasions, the necklace, the brooches, the supporting jewels. She never wore the tiara. After her mother's death in 2002, she loaned the Delhi Durbar tiara to Camilla, who wore it at a Norwegian state banquet in London in October 2005. Its only documented public appearance in more than half a century. The classic diamond bandeau, made by Gerard in 1932 for Queen Mary with the County of Lincoln brooch as its centerpiece, came to Elizabeth in the 1953 bequest and remained in the vault for decades. It appeared publicly only when Meghan Markle wore it at her 2018 wedding, at which point the piece had not been seen in public since the 1940s. In a single day, it acquired a new identity, its mid-century history effectively superseded by a wedding that 3 billion people watched on television. The tiara Elizabeth received from Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark, Prince Philip's mother, who had taken holy orders by 1947 and was living as a nun by the time of Philip and Elizabeth's wedding, is a delicate diamond bandeau featuring a meander design in the Greek key tradition. The gift had a specificity to it, a piece connecting the new husband to his family, from the woman who had survived the Greek royal family's exile and had lived through circumstances that would have broken most people. Elizabeth was never photographed wearing it. She loaned it to Princess Anne and formally gave it to Anne in 1972, the piece becoming Anne's, carrying its meander design into decades of formal appearances that Elizabeth never gave it herself. The lotus flower tiara, made from a diamond and pearl necklace that was a 1923 wedding gift to the Queen Mother, moved through Princess Margaret's ownership. Margaret wore it frequently across her adult life, before arriving back at the main Windsor line after both the Queen Mother and Margaret died in 2002. Elizabeth apparently possessed it, or had access to it, but never wore it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, began wearing it in 2013 and has made it a signature piece for evening occasions, its lotus blossom motifs finding their occasion decades after the necklace it was built from was first pinned to a young Duchess of York. The pattern across all these pieces is consistent. A woman with a settled, confident tiara wardrobe accumulated extraordinary objects across her lifetime through inheritance, bequest, and gift, and chose not to integrate them into her established rotation. Not because they were damaged, not because they were unavailable, because by the time they arrived, she had already decided what she needed to say, and she was saying it with pieces she had chosen and tested and worn until they became part of her public identity. Royal historians and jewelry experts have offered various frameworks for why a specific queen might not wear a specific piece. Elizabeth II left no documented record of her reasoning for any individual case. The reasons, where we can infer them, work in several distinct registers, and often more than one operates simultaneously on any given piece. Physical constraints are the most literal factor, and among the most consistently underestimated. A tiara must grip a specific head, sit at a specific angle, and remain stable across hours of standing, formal greetings, and diplomatic conversation. Princess Diana reportedly suffered persistent headaches from the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara. Its weight and the way it distributed across her head caused discomfort significant enough to be recorded, and yet she wore it repeatedly, because it had become so central to her public identity that the physical cost was worth bearing. Elizabeth's own experience with the Nizam of Hyderabad tiara produced a different conclusion. After the state dinner in Ottawa, where she described the piece as close to falling in the soup, she kept wearing it for a time, and then she had it dismantled. The physical reality of wearing a tiara that doesn't work, that slips, that shifts, that pulls at the base, is experienced as a live problem on a live head in front of live audiences. It isn't abstract. Scale relative to height and hairstyle operates at a different level but with similar decisiveness. Elizabeth II was 5'4". Her hairstyle, the symmetrical curl set maintained by Ian Carmichael across 23 years of service, created a specific silhouette at a specific height above her head. That silhouette was the base on which every tiara decision rested. Pieces that worked within its proportions became permanent fixtures. Pieces that dominated or overwhelmed it, too tall, too broad, too architecturally assertive for a woman of her particular height, with her particular profile, had nowhere comfortable to go. The Delhi Durbar tiara, made for a ceremony attended by 30,000 people in a Delhi amphitheater, was built for visibility at that scale. On a 5'4" woman at a Buckingham Palace state dinner, it would have read as something else entirely. Emotional memory operates at a deeper register and is harder to document precisely, but its effects on object management are consistent across the historical record. The Strathmore Rose arrived in Elizabeth II's collection, saturated with her mother's personal history, not royal history, but family history. A gift from a Scottish earl to his daughter on her wedding day, before rank and ceremony had fully consumed the private person. The Queen Mother wore it during the years when she was still navigating the identity gap between the woman she had been and the Queen Consort she was becoming. She stopped wearing it before that gap closed entirely. If Elizabeth treated it as a memorial object rather than a working tool, that behavior would be consistent with how the monarchy has always managed pieces tied to personal loss or private intimacy, kept close, not displayed. Memorial jewelry isn't the same as ceremonial jewelry, and the failure to distinguish between them is partly what makes the Strathmore Rose's silence so difficult to read from outside. Succession politics, the informal understanding that certain pieces belong through association and repetition to certain women, shaped vault decisions more systematically than almost any other factor. The Grarevel tiara, the diamond honeycomb piece that was the Queen Mother's signature, passed to Camilla almost immediately after the Queen Mother's death. Elizabeth loaned it quickly enough that Camilla wore it at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2013, and has made it her primary royal jewel. The lover's knot tiara, which Elizabeth had worn in the early 1950s and then loaned to Diana as part of the 1981 wedding gift suite, was so thoroughly identified with Diana by the mid-1980s that Elizabeth effectively retired it from her own appearances. Catherine pulled it out of storage in 2015 and has since worn it so consistently that it has acquired a new set of associations, Diana's image still visible behind it, but Catherine's now layered on top. In each case, a piece belongs to a woman, not through legal assignment, but through use, through repetition, through the accumulated weight of public recognition. Once that association forms in the public imagination, the original owner's presence in the piece is effectively foreclosed. The right occasion simply not arriving is a practical explanation that gets dismissed more often than it deserves. Tiaras in the British royal context appear at state dinners, diplomatic receptions, and formal galas, specific, relatively infrequent occasions that fall within a defined calendar. Elizabeth II attended roughly 4 major formal tiara occasions per year across her reign, for a total of approximately 280 across 70 years. She wore around 12 pieces publicly. The collection held many more than that. Pieces that weren't already embedded in her established rotation required a deliberate inaugural choice. She had to want to debut them, and not every occasion warranted novelty over the reassurance of established vocabulary. Years can pass without a moment asking specifically for a new piece. The final category is the hardest to name cleanly, but in some ways the most revealing: constitutional caution about the signals that specific objects emit. Elizabeth II was constitutionally deliberate about what every public appearance communicated. A tiara with complex provenance, a bequest from a controversial society figure, a piece with imperial associations that no longer fit the post-colonial moment of a commonwealth rather than an empire. A piece too closely identified with a family branch currently under political pressure, carried a communicative weight that could exceed its gemological value. Wearing it would have meant something specific. Not wearing it meant nothing, or rather, meant nothing publicly. The vault absorbed the question and held it in suspension indefinitely. None of these frameworks fully explains any single case. Multiple factors almost certainly operated simultaneously on every piece that remained unworn. What they collectively establish is that Elizabeth II's silence around specific tiaras wasn't indifference. It was judgment. The vault was where she kept her most complicated decisions, not permanently, but in suspension, waiting for circumstances that might resolve the complexity into clarity. Every non-appearance was as deliberate as every appearance. Since September 8, 2022, the vault has been moving. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has become the most active curator of dormant pieces in the collection. The Strathmore Rose at the South Korean State Banquet in November 2023, a century after the Queen Mother first received it from her father, was the most striking recent example. A piece that had spent nearly 90 years in the vaults, emerging on the head of a woman who is now the Princess of Wales, wearing it with the specific weight of what it represents. The Bowes-Lyon family before it became the Windsor dynasty. The early private history of the family that Elizabeth II never made public through this particular object. The effect, for those who knew the provenance, was startling. But Catherine had been drawing from the dormant collection for years before that. She pulled the lotus flower tiara into her rotation in 2013. She began wearing the Cambridge Lover's Knot in 2015, a piece Diana had made famous in the 1980s, and has now worn it with such frequency and ownership that it carries dual identity. Diana's presence visible behind it, Catherine's layered on top. For state banquets and diplomatic receptions, it has become her signature in the way the girls of Great Britain and Ireland became Elizabeth's. A piece worn enough times that it reads as a face. Princess Beatrice wore Queen Mary's fringe tiara at her July 17, 2020 wedding, a ceremony of approximately 30 people at Windsor Castle, held under COVID-19 restrictions that limited gatherings to that size. The fringe tiara, with its 47 graduated brilliant and rose-cut diamond bars alternating with narrower diamond spikes, is a piece that Gerard's ledger records in handwriting, dated November 3, 1919. Mounting 633 brilliants and 271 rose diamonds from the Queen's own tiara, bracelet, and monogram in gold and silver settings in a Russian pattern tiara with adjustable head frame. Over a century later, those same 633 brilliants sat above Beatrice's head at a garden ceremony, with a guest list smaller than most dinner parties. She paired the tiara with a gown drawn from Elizabeth II's own wardrobe, a Norman Hartnell evening coat, refashioned for the occasion. The piece had passed through Queen Mary, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth II, and Princess Anne. Beatrice was the fourth family bride to wear it. The occasion had a particular quality, a small, quiet wedding during a pandemic, stripped of the ceremonial apparatus normally surrounding a royal marriage, in which the piece doing the most visible dynastic work wasn't a new commission, but a tiara over 100 years old, worn in an English country garden by a woman whose grandmother had worn it to marry Prince Philip at Westminster Abbey in 1947, and whose great-grandmother had worn it regularly across her own tenure as Queen Consort. The continuity was impossible to miss. Princess Eugenie's October 2018 appearance in the Grarevel Emerald Kokoshnik represents the most dramatic vault opening in the recent record. The $13 million tiara's first public royal wearing, after 75 years of vault residency spanning 2 consecutive female owners who each held it without deploying it, was at her wedding ceremony in St. George's Chapel. The piece had arrived in a black tin trunk in 1943. It walked into St. George's Chapel in October 2018. Between those 2 dates, the entire arc of the post-war British monarchy had unfolded. The coronation of 1953, the moon landing, the dissolution of the empire, the rise of the Commonwealth, the death of Diana, the marriages and divorces of 3 of Elizabeth's 4 children. The Kokoshnik had been present for all of it, and visible for none of it. For Princess Charlotte, now 11 years old, no formal plans exist in any public record. What exists is a vault that remains substantial. Pieces not seen in decades, some not seen in generations, their stories still incomplete. Royal expert Katie Nicholl, speaking shortly after Elizabeth's death, speculated about Prince Philip's 3-carat diamond engagement ring, made from diamonds taken from his mother, Princess Alice's tiara, that it wouldn't be buried with the Queen and might eventually find its way to Charlotte. Nothing is confirmed. The vault will reveal itself gradually, through appearances that will only be fully legible in retrospect. The mechanism by which pieces move forward is partly formal and partly fluid. Long-term loans accumulate a different kind of ownership over time, through public association, if not legal title. The Grarevel tiara has been Camilla's piece for so long, worn at so many significant occasions, that it would be surprising if the formal record didn't eventually ratify what the public record already reflects. The lover's knot is Catherine's now in the same way, not through any document, but through the weight of accumulated presence. The Strathmore Rose may be on that trajectory after November 2023. Each appearance calcifies a new association. What Elizabeth II demonstrated across 70 years is that the vault isn't a passive space. She managed the dormant collection actively, with consequences that are still unfolding. The Cartier halo was given formally to Princess Anne in 1972, nearly 40 years before Catherine wore it in 2011, a decision made well in advance of the occasion that justified it. The Grarevel Kokoshnik was authorized for Eugenie's specific wedding. The Strathmore Rose was held intact, confirmed by Hugh Roberts' photographs, through a decade of internet speculation about its condition, through the entire remainder of Elizabeth's reign. These weren't accidents of neglect. They were preparations without recipients yet identified, objects held in readiness for moments that hadn't arrived. Susie Menkes, writing in The Royal Jewels in 1985, argued that royal jewelry functions not merely as aesthetic display, but as political instrument and personal signal, that the choice of what to wear is always also a choice about what to communicate, and that the choice of what not to wear communicates just as precisely. Hugh Roberts' The Queen's Diamonds, published in 2012, operates from the same premise at the level of provenance and photographic documentation, each piece treated not simply as a beautiful object, but as an object with a history of choices attached to it. Which hands it passed through, which occasions it attended, which occasions it didn't. Elizabeth II owned the Cartier halo tiara for 67 years and never placed it on her own head in public. She owned the Grarevel Emerald Kokoshnik for 20 years after inheriting it in 2002, authorized it for one specific woman at one specific occasion, and kept it in the vault through the entirety of her final 2 decades. She received the Strathmore Rose in 2002 and preserved it, intact, as Roberts' photographs confirm, through an entire decade of online speculation about its condition, with no public use until her death at 96. This isn't extravagance. It isn't neglect. It's governance by object. Every state occasion where Elizabeth II appeared in the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara communicated legibility, continuity, and institutional confidence. Every state occasion where she appeared without the Delhi Durbar tiara, made for a ceremony celebrating an empire that no longer existed, in a language of imperial grandeur that no longer fit the Commonwealth she actually presided over, communicated something equally deliberate. The vault was where she kept her most complicated decisions, not in perpetuity, in suspension, waiting for the circumstances that might resolve them. A piece held in the vault accumulates no public association. It arrives at its eventual debut carrying only what it carries from history, not from the last person to wear it in a memorable photograph. The Strathmore Rose in November 2023 arrived carrying the Queen Mother's personal Bose Lion history. Nothing more recent, nothing that might interfere. The Grarevel Kokoshnik arrived at Eugenie's 2018 wedding, carrying Margaret Grarevel's Boucheron commission from 1919, and the weight of its center stone. No competing image of a more recent royal wearer to contend with. The Cartier halo arrived at Catherine's 2011 wedding as a piece crafted for a woman who became queen. Each of those meanings was impossible while the pieces stayed in the vault. They became possible only when the vault opened. The vault opened on Elizabeth II's schedule. The decisions she made about timing, about which woman, about which occasion, shaped the available meanings of those pieces in ways that will persist for generations. The pieces that remain, and there are pieces that remain, are waiting, not for display, for the right woman, the right moment, the right meaning. A tiara from a black tin trunk, waiting 80 years to find its occasion. A rose motif bandeau moving from a Scottish earl's hands to a duchess's head, to a vault, to a princess's brow, 100 years and several monarchies later, as if the object itself were patient. Royal jewelry is a map. The pieces Elizabeth II wore mark the territory she chose to claim publicly. The pieces she didn't wear mark the territory she chose to hold in reserve, for other women, for other moments, for the particular kind of power that accumulates in waiting. A tiara doesn't need to be worn to matter. Sometimes the most powerful jewel in a monarchy is the one that stays in the dark, waiting for the next woman to be judged worthy of bringing it back into the light. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe.